and modern-style world beat music. Music from Africa, Spain, France, Japan, China, heck, even songs and artists from the United States itself. So join me every Saturday at 11 a.m. only on the KSJE 90.9 FM.
How do you know what to make of the news? Is it politically inflected? Is it stenography? Is it just plain untrue? On the Media helps you decode the news. We reveal the process behind the story because there's sometimes as much to be learned from the gathering as from the news itself. Please join us.
Saturday mornings at 7 on KSJE Farmington. KSJE is supported by San Juan Regional Medical Center, here to meet your urgent and emergent medical needs, whether they are COVID-19 related or not. Medical emergencies happen when you least expect them. Whether it's a stroke, heart attack, illness, or injury, San Juan Regional Medical Center's caregivers are here to provide care to you and your loved ones. Find out more online at sanjuanregional.com. Ten minutes past 8 o'clock. It's Thursday morning, October the 1st. Good morning, everyone. I'm Scott Micklin, and thank you for tuning in to KSJE 90.9 FM over the air here in San Juan County, New Mexico, 103.3 FM over the air in the Durango, Colorado area, and of course streaming everywhere from our website, ksje.com. Welcome also to our viewers who are watching this visual radio program. It is streaming live to the KSJE YouTube channel, our Facebook page, and through technology, our Twitter feed as well this morning. It's great to have you along with us to watch the program. Coming up in the next few moments, my guest today is local archaeologist Paul Reed. He's going to be here in just a few moments. We'll be talking about a number of issues, including Chaco Canyon, some of the Native American tribes and pueblos, and their work to protect Chaco, all coming up in the next few moments, so stay tuned for that right here on KSJE. Then, of course, we will have our local information program for the community about COVID-19, the coronavirus. That is live streaming at 9 a.m. today on our YouTube channel and Facebook page and our Twitter feed as well. This morning, we'll be talking with a teacher who has suddenly become an online teacher and talk a little bit about some of the challenges involved with that. And also, we'll hear about some of the changes with trash pickup, recycling, and things like that with a guest from Waste Management, the district manager, coming up today, as well as sharing some of the other information for you. That's live at 9 a.m., of course, on YouTube and Facebook and Twitter, and a rebroadcast on the radio this afternoon at 5:06 on KSJE 90.9, 103.3, and KSJE.com. On the radio side of things at 9 a.m., Mick Hess will take us roving with the arts, and this morning, Mick is featuring music from Franz Schubert on the program, so you'll hear that on the radio at 9 this morning. Don't forget, of course, in addition to Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter, you can also connect with KSJE on our Instagram page as well. Let's talk about the weather forecast. Continued mild and sunny weather for the next several days. In fact, the foreseeable future. Take a look. 81 and sunny today in Farmington. It'll be clear, and 39 overnight. Partly sunny skies on Friday with a high tomorrow of 79 degrees. It'll be sunny and 80 again on Saturday, 81 on Sunday, 80 on Monday, just near 80 degrees for the next several days into next week as well. So a pretty decent forecast, except if you're looking for precipitation, you're not going to see any of that. And overnight lows right near the mid to lower 40s. So let me turn to my guest, who is patiently standing by, joining us via Zoom this morning. Local archaeologist Paul Reed is here this morning. Paul, good morning. Good to see you.
Good morning, Scott. Glad to be back on with you.
You bet. It's great to have you here. And we are talking about Chaco Canyon. And, of course, there's been a lot of conversations about that. And you've been doing a lot of work and a lot of outreach to the Pueblos and Native American tribes when we talk about Chaco Canyon, because the issue continues to be about protecting kind of the outer boundaries, if you will, of Chaco. I always like to remind folks the park itself is always protected, but we are talking a lot about these other kind of fringe and buffer areas around the park, correct?
Right. And you know, as we've talked in prior shows, the focus is really on the 10-mile zone that lies outside the park boundary, but which really is potentially subject to a lot of different impacts. So those are the things we're concerned about.
Sure. And so can you give us an update kind of on the latest? I know last time we spoke, you were mentioning that you've been working with some of the tribes and pueblos, and they seem to be kind of working together in almost a unified effort, and that's something that really hasn't happened much in the past. Isn't that true?
Right. So we just passed through the end of the comment period for, Farmington BLM, BIA down in Gallup, their big planning process, their resource management plan amendments and draft environmental impact statement. There's a whole lot of acronyms in there, but
right.
I read an email one time and I think it was entirely an acronym. So it's interesting the way we communicate, right? But so that deadline passed a week ago tomorrow. So at the end of September. And so folks had to get comments in and say, here's what we would like the agencies to think about. So as part of that effort, really this summer and stretching back into the spring, we worked with a variety of groups, our big coalition, which is National Trust for Historic Preservation, National Parks and Monuments Association, the Conservation Lands Foundation, Wilderness Society, a whole bunch of groups. And really, as we've talked before, we've connected with the El Pueblo Council of Governors, which is the 19 New Mexico Pueblos plus Isleta del Sur down in El Paso. So 20 groups that have Pueblo, strong Pueblos of today and ancestry back to Chaco. I've been working with them since 2016 to, think about different ways to protect Chaco. And they came out very early and said, this 10-mile zone of protection is really a good thing, and let's support that. So we've kind of gotten to the end of, a 6.5-year process at this point to work with the partners, work with the tribes, get the comments in, and now the agencies are going to ponder these. I haven't gotten a final count from them, but I think they're in the 20,000 comment range. So
wow.
A lot of people very interested in this issue, and as well they should be, because this planning process, mostly with the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA, as well as National Historic Preservation Act, NHPA, this is going to govern, how cultural resources, how oil and gas, how these things are managed for the next 10 to 15 years. So, it really is a big deal. But for my own efforts, I was glad to sort of get to the end of that cycle.
Right.
Just a whole lot of effort into it. And one of the things I did this summer, as we had discussed, was just working out in this 10-mile zone. And for me, I had worked at different areas, really every direction around Chaco over the last 30 years. But some of these areas were brand new to me. So that was really just on a purely personal and professional level, aside from policy and whatever else, just a great experience to get out there and experience that. But then to see these ancient communities and the historic Navajo communities, and just try to really work on some solutions for let's maybe have the oil and gas development here, but let's not have it over here. And so I'm hoping that we can strike that balance. And this is something that we've talked about for 6 years now, is how to have the oil and gas that we need to take us in to, the next era. And we're making a good green transition, definitely, but we're going to have some overlap and protect people living on the ground, the Navajo families who are out there, and protect this irreplaceable archaeological record, that for Chaco is, sort of primetime Chaco, 81,000, basically, but also sites that are thousands of years older and sites that are only 100 or 200 years old.
Right.
It's an incredible record, of, human history in the area.
And I understand that. And you sent me a couple of articles this morning, Paul Reed, in relation to this, that about this survey that's being done, and that's what you're talking about that you've been working on, correct? Is
right.
Kind of looking around and trying to discover exactly what is in this area that's being discussed. And so I want to kind of share that with our viewers just a little bit. There's one from the AP. About this survey. And so I think it might be fascinating for a lot of our listeners and viewers to realize that maybe as much as we know about Chaco, that maybe there are still some sites in and around in this buffer area that haven't really been looked at very closely or surveyed, even if we can see them by a satellite, but still sometimes you got to get boots on the ground, don't you?
Right, exactly. So Chaco and the park that sits inside this has been 100% surveyed. That was a big effort from sort of the late 60s into the early 80s, and different pieces around the park have been surveyed. But when I did my assessment, we were looking at an area, if we exclude the park acreage, but we look at the 10-mile zones that were proposed and passed the U.S. House last year, and with a bill that's still pending in this Senate, which we're unlikely to pass in this sort of contentious election year. But we're looking at about 700,000 acres. So it's an area many times the size of the park that sits in the middle. And in looking at, with the state records for what projects have been done and other things, we're probably at about 15, at the high end, 20% survey coverage for this area. So that means that 80% of the land has not had cultural resource investigations. And so, yeah, there's potential to find a lot more. One of the things that I did, and this was really the main focus of this for me, was to identify clusters of these historic and cultural sites. And in some cases, we know that those occur within a fairly short time frame, say, 50 years or so. If there's 20 sites all dating within that tight time frame, then that's an actual face-to-face community, say at 1100, at a spot north of Chaco. Others might include sites that date as early as 6,000 years ago or 8,000 years ago, all the way up until 100 years ago. So those are more just clusters of sites. But part of the objective here was to identify the clusters, do a little more work with the records and in the field, and say, okay, these are discrete communities. And we feel, as archaeologists, and working with the Pueblos as I have, that these are resources that should be set aside. So we shouldn't allow oil and gas to get inside the boundaries of this community. And this is something that would be different from the way that the agencies typically manage, where archaeological sites, historic sites are identified, their boundaries are put on them in the GIS, on the maps, and then they keep the development about 100 feet away. But what you end up with is a whole bunch of ancient sites that are sort of these little islands, but then you might have oil and gas infrastructure crisscrossing the whole area. And this relates to some of the photos that I've shared before with viewers. When you fly over the area north of Chaco's 10-mile zone, that's when you see this spiderweb network of roads, pipelines, and all the oil and gas development. Well, that industrial landscape, if you will, is intruding on the ancient, Puebloan and earlier, and the more recent historic Navajo landscape. So those are some of the effects that we're trying to get the BLM and the BIA to address in this plan, and say, hey, maybe we put a larger zone of protection or a buffer, around this community, and you keep the oil and gas at this margin. And that would really be a revolutionary move, in my view, because it's, as I said, it's all about individual sites with boundaries. You get all the artifacts and the structures in there, and you say, we protected the site. But if you put a giant oil and gas facility 100 feet away from an archaeological site, you've impacted that site. And that's, so that's kind of the hard sell, I think, for us, is to get the agencies to actually agree that that's a significant impact, and the work that I've done with several Pueblo tribes out there is they're like, yeah, that's absolutely an impact to the site, even though you haven't disturbed the physical structure, if that makes sense.
Right. And let me play devil's advocate for just a moment, Paul Reed, because I think, our friends in the oil and gas industry would say, but isn't the current process working? And we've seen that when maybe there's been interest in a parcel that maybe is near a protected site or near something that needs to be protected, that the BLM, for example, would remove that parcel from the leasing process, and that has been happening recently. Isn't that so? Wouldn't they say that this is the process that we have is working just fine?
Well, right. I mean, I would say that has worked in some cases, but it's all a matter. It's really a question of how far from the cultural resources in these ancient communities we're going to be. And like I said, this 50 to 100 foot standard is really what they generally use. Now, in rare cases, that we've talked a little bit about the Pierre's archaeological community, which sits on the edge of the 10 mile north of Chaco. The BLM, more than 20 years ago, put in place what they call an area of critical environmental concern. So another acronym, but it's ACEC. And these are for natural areas, they're for cultural areas. There's different ways to do this.
Right.
That was put in place.
Sounds
and,
like someone let the dogs in.
Yeah,
that's new.
My dog has an opinion on whether we should protect sites with more ACECs.
I understand.
But one of the things that we've done, and I'm figuring out a way to make this available on our website because there is sensitive archaeological information, but the BLM protected part of this Pierre's community with the ACEC, but there are substantial areas outside which are not part of that protection zone. So I think that's part of the challenge and I think in good faith, BLM from a couple decades ago said, hey, we've protected Pierre's, it's good. Well, a colleague of mine, Ruth Van Dyke, went out in 2017 and did a study of the view, what we call the view shed, from site to site, this great house to that one, to this special, perhaps shrine facility over here. And then she also recorded sound. And what she found is, that the essence of that ancient community with the sound and the view really had been impacted by the oil and gas. And I made this point a few years ago when I took a Daily Times reporter up on Pierre's. We got up on there, and when the wind quieted down, the first thing we heard was a well pad, to the southwest thumping away. So, the site does not have a well pad next to it, but this well pad 1,000 feet away is impacting our understanding and the general area around the community.
Sure.
And so the idea is that maybe not every site that has 10 or 15 artifacts needs, a big zone of protection or a buffer around it. But maybe for some of these more special places, we can keep the oil and gas further away. So that's really the essence of what we're in. And, I guess in the terms of today, we're kind of down in the weeds now, right? Trying to understand this problem at a more detailed level. But for the groups that I've worked with, we went out with Acoma. We have a project planned with the Pueblo Zuni. It is about how the sites are impacted by the modern industrial landscape and the intrusion on their ancestral sites. So if they're on top of a place and they're trying to look over to another spot on a high spot and another one over here, and they see 3 well pads in the way and they hear 2 of them clicking away, that's an impact. And, going back 30, 40 years, maybe people weren't aware of that, but we're aware of it now. So the point is, let's try to manage these a little more carefully today. And, Pierre's is, in some ways, it's a damage done scenario, right? It's sitting there. There's 12 to 16 well pads in the view shed. There are oil and gas storage facilities. There's a compressor fairly close. There's the noise. There's the smell, So some of that has already happened there. But we take Pierre's as an example of here's a way we can better manage a site like this and a community like this. So that's what I've been doing this summer, is looking for other areas that might, merit some additional protections. And those are things that I'm going to be doing in additional work with BLM.
Right.
Is proposing specific areas, to up the level of protection a little. And that's going to have, the weight of the Pueblo groups that we've worked with saying, yeah, this is something that we support. And this isn't about just trying to limit oil and gas for its own sake. That's sometimes people imagine, well, if we ask different groups, the preservationists like me and the tribes, they're just going to say everything's important. That's not what we're doing. We're trying really hard to identify the areas that truly are of special importance and significance and get them the protection that, we feel and the tribes feel they need. So, as we've talked many times, Scott, it's this intricate balance in our complicated 21st century world. And we just want a little more on the preservation side of that balance equation, I think.
Sure.
And I think we can do that, and we can still, do the oil and gas development safely, responsibly, where it's not impacting people living on the ground and the sites that, all of us, or most of us, care about deeply.
Right. Understood. My guest this morning is local archaeologist Paul Reed. He works with Salmon Ruins and Archaeologist Southwest, and is certainly very passionate about the Chaco Canyon area, which has been in the news a lot recently about some protections. The BLM is just, as Paul mentioned earlier, ended the comment period about a week or so ago for a resource plan for that area. And so, but it's not just BLM land that's down there, Paul, right? It's as we call it, the checkerboard. So there's a whole hodgepodge, if you will, of of other folks that may have interests in that land. And so that's another kind of complicating factor, I guess, in this conversation is, while you might get the BLM to agree, maybe you've got the Bureau of Indian Affairs that is on its own, a separate page, and the state of New Mexico over on a third page, and a Latese somewhere else. So that's all has to be part of the conversation and the solution, correct?
Right. And that's one of the things that has made this very complicated, and I know that folks maybe monitoring this at some level are, saying, okay, didn't they start this process in February of 2014?
Right.
And they did. That's when BLM formally announced that they were going to modify this. Well, they worked independently for a couple of years, and then due to some of our efforts and the Public Governors Council and our partners, when it was still under the Obama administration, we got them to add BIA to this larger process because it was like, well, we have 20% of the land roughly is Farmington Field Office managed. The other 80% is state land and it's Navajo Nation, and as you mentioned, it's Latee holders. So we felt like the Bureau of Indian Affairs had to be involved. So they got involved. The process got a little bigger, and the wheels of government, slowed down as the process got bigger. But it's a complicated situation. The good news from a preservation standpoint, we've talked about this on the air before, is our state land commissioner, Stephanie Garcia Richard, issued an order when she came into office to remove about 77,000 acres of state trust lands in, a version of a 10-mile zone, a little bit different with the state land boundaries.
Right.
So that, we're not going to have development of oil and gas right next to Chaco's boundary. And this has been a big concern because there was a group that got a lease on Chaco's south boundary. So if folks have been to Chaco and you drive out to the south, sort of towards Crown Point and just, out the southern way, there was a drill rig that appeared there, a few years ago. And there was a lot of concern that there was going to be oil and gas activity right there. So Chaco is a World Heritage Site. This is one of 3 in New Mexico. We're really blessed to have that many in our state. And only 22 in place countrywide, and I think a few more having been proposed. So this is an area that deserves a different level of consideration for this, and that's really the point that we've been trying to make, and trying to work with a whole bunch of different partners and work all that out. So yeah, it's, as you said, very complicated.
Right. And with the actions from the state land commissioner in New Mexico, I mean, should there be some more permanent legislation maybe passed? Because could this be overturned by the next land commissioner, or someone has a change of heart in another administration? I mean, is that concerning to folks that do the work like you, that this stuff may not be permanent, and as we see, things kind of maybe get changed unless it's really memorialized in some type of legislation?
That's right, because, the political winds blow hither and yon.
Yes,
we may well have a new land commissioner either in the next term or the one after that who decides that we should step backwards from our perspective. So yeah, it would be great from my perspective to have a bill come up in the New Mexico legislature to do this. I think people would look at it and potentially get alarmed because we've already had declining revenues, of course, with the pandemic, and it's challenging times for our state, but others of us would say this is the point that we're at, and we need to continue to take concrete steps to move into a tourist economy and maybe a more green industrial economy, and we've certainly made the strides on wind and solar, as other folks you've had on the show talked about. So I think we can continue to strike that balance. I would be very much in favor of some legislation, through our state to protect these state trust lands, and as part of that model, the land commissioner is not just saying these are not going to generate any revenue. She's working hard with, her staff to come up with other ways to generate revenue because, as we've talked on the show before, our state trust lands are about funding education, from kindergarten all the way through our colleges, and our community colleges. So that's a very important thing to keep in the mix.
Sure.
Like all the problems in our world, there's no easy answer. We'll give you one sentence, Scott, and this will solve it all.
Yeah, that'd be great, but we can't do that.
So, it's part of the messiness of our process. But if we're working how we should as a state through our democratic process, I think we eventually end up where we need to, even if we have to compromise from different angles.
Right, right. Well, let me ask you a little bit about another article that you sent from the New Mexico Political Report. Again, talking about the survey and working to identify sites in Greater Chaco for protections. And so, but it kind of, again, focuses more on the Native American pueblos and tribes that are in our state and maybe have kind of gotten a greater interest in learning about Chaco and maybe learning how they're connected to Chaco and why this is so important even to them, even if they are now a couple hundred miles away from the site.
Right, exactly. And I think that's that distance is part of the challenge for public groups, descendant public groups who trace their ancestry back to Chaco, Mesa Verde, Solomon, Aztec, these ancient places of the past, but have, on their migrations and the movement through time, have now ended up in different places. So, yeah, one of the things that we've been very interested in since we jumped into this in 2014 is working with those communities, as well as the Navajo Nation, to, get folks back out onto their ancestral landscapes. And I'm really happy to say that we've completed a project with Acoma, and we're, I think, getting close to having Acoma go through their full approval process and allow the public part of that report then to come out. And we were able, with Acoma's consent, to sort of excerpt portions of that to go in with specific comments to the agencies, which I think will improve their management. We've got a project with Zuni that's planned, and of course the pandemic has been very challenging for us. And for the tribes in particular, Zuni has had, one of the highest rates, unfortunately, of COVID infection amongst the Pueblos and tribes in New Mexico. But hopefully they're emerging from that. And so we're going to see if we might be able to get out in the field next month. It, of course, depends on the winter time, which is variable.
Sure.
The other thing that, I wanted to mention, and this is something that, in the press event we did on Monday, Congresswoman Holland was asked about and confirmed, the $1 million ethnographic cultural study that was funded through the Department of Interior and is, in BIA's hands, they've finally approved some proposals. So those monies are going to be available both to the Navajo Nation as one project and then to a coalition of Pueblos. So the work that we're doing is somewhat smaller in scale, but it's going to connect to that as well. So I think what we're really going to have, Scott, is just a wealth of new information, sort of both for the Pueblos, the Navajo Nation to use internally, but then also things that they can share with the agencies to better manage what's going on with these processes.
Right. Very good. And I wanted to say too, Paul Reed, that I think it sounds like that, and it seems to me, correct me if I'm wrong, that our Native American friends and neighbors are getting a stronger voice when it comes to maybe talking about some of these issues that really directly relate to them, where maybe, 20, 30 years ago, they may not have been sitting at the table to have these important conversations and be part of some of these negotiations and legislation or whatever the case may be about what the future holds.
Right, absolutely. And this is something that I think as the dominant society has done better in terms of outreach and consultation. I think the agencies have tried to step up their game. I'm just gonna relocate myself a little, Scott. I apologize about
a little bit of background noise. We understand. That's not a problem. I'll let you relocate to another spot there where you're joining us from, but it's a live broadcast, and that's what happens. So it's okay. It's okay.
We have all the excitement of that.
That's right. No problem.
Yeah. So, right, and I think also as sort of archaeologists and anthropologists, we're beginning to do a better job of involving the descendant groups in this work that is very important to them.
Right.
And I think I can say as an archaeologist that we haven't done a good job, as a discipline really until rather recently to involve folks in studying their own heritage and doing that. When I worked for Navajo Nation way back 30 years ago, I was part of a program that got many young Navajo tribal members involved in doing archaeology and learning things. So the efforts have been underway for a long time, but we can certainly do better. And I'm really excited to have, so many different Pueblo descendant groups working, to protect their own heritage and to really work on understanding their connections to it better.
Right.
So we're working with 8 or 9 pueblos in a fairly active way to either just help them find funding to do their own separate projects, and that project through Interior and BIA is entirely tribally managed, and we're not part of it, and I don't think they're involving other non-tribal members except where they need different expertise to plug into.
Sure.
So that's what's great about it, because if we're doing sort of non-indigenous Euro-American archaeology on other people's heritage, those are things that people have become concerned about lately. So that's part of what we're trying to do, broaden our perspectives, and as the people who aren't affiliated with some of the sites, protect them as best we can, but in some cases really just step aside and let folks manage their own heritage. So so I think we're making some real concrete steps, taking some good steps,
right,
in that sense.
Very good. Well, and Paul Reed, last question. I think we're running out of time this morning, but I did want to ask you, when we're dealing with maybe congressional legislation, state legislation, multiple levels of government agencies and things like that, how important is it maybe for the Native American pueblos and tribes that are involved with this to have a unified consensus, I guess, as to what they want to see happen, instead of having maybe a dozen or so different opinions about what should be happening?
Right. I mean, speaking as an outsider, it's my perception that, a unified voice is very helpful. And that's, I think, where, at least on the Pueblo side of it, the All Pueblo Council of Governors has been great. So this is, as I mentioned, a group that has 19 New Mexico Pueblos and the one in Texas, and they meet every month. Well, this year, of course, it's been virtual meetings. But, in a normal calendar year, they get together every month and they discuss the broad issues that affect them.
Right.
And I've personally, done presentations to that group every year except this year with the challenges faced.
Sure.
So I think, work very hard to have that unified voice. And then individual groups, the Pueblo of Acoma, of course, has been one of our strongest partners. Governor Brian Bayo, been a huge advocate and a big voice for that. We've worked closely with Zuni, some of the other Pueblos. But I agree that having that voice is great. The other thing is, in 2017 and 2019, the Pueblos at one of their governor's meetings invited the Navajo Nation president and representatives to come. And they agreed that a 10-mile zone of protection was what Chaco needed. So, so the Navajo Nation president, 2 presidents, first Mr. Benally and now Jonathan Nez, have come out and said, we support the protection of this 10-mile zone. Now, other opinions have come into it since then, but
right.
I think that I don't really think there are any Native American groups in our area who aren't concerned about having this area protected.
Sure.
And to find that right mix of protection and, responsible development.
Right. And I guess just to wrap things up, the question would be, is it going to be a 5-mile or a 10-mile, or what is the actual radius that we're talking about? That is still open for discussion in some areas, right?
Right. And see, BLM and BIA have an alternative. It was designated with the letter B and then 1 as a 10-mile zone of, no development, again, just on the federally managed lands, the BLM side. So there have been concerns that have floated around, and when Navajo Nation has discussed this, people have said, this is going to shut down all development. And they were referencing like the Bennett Freeze, over in the Hopi and Navajo country,
right,
which didn't allow people to work on their homes. Well, that is not at all what we're talking about here. It was simply this about 20% of the BLM to not have surface impacts there. We still have a bill in this Senate. It's, as I said earlier, unlikely to pass. So, we'll have our election now in just over a month, and we'll see, which way the political winds are blowing.
That's right.
Again, in 2021, we may have a very different situation in terms of, what tools we have, say, to protect Chaco. But, we weighed in so heavily with the agencies on their plans because, aside from political considerations for the next 2 to 4 years or whatever period we might be talking about, we would like some permanent protection in place, at least for the life of these management plans.
Right. Understood. Well, it's an ongoing conversation, and we're glad to have you available to keep giving us information and talking about it. Paul Reed, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. I'm sorry about the disturbance. we're
That's okay.
visiting my son here in Austin, and someone decided to do some lovely landscaping work right outside where I was set up in his home office.
Well, now is the time to do it before it gets really hot there in Texas, so I can understand why they'd be out this time of day. But not a problem. Great to talk to you. Safe travels home, and we'll see you soon.
Thanks, Scott.
Thank you. That's Paul Reed, everyone, from Salmon Ruins and Archaeology Southwest. My guest here on KSJE. Back with more in just a moment. The time right now is 8:44.
Hi, I'm Scott Micklin. As a longtime resident and advocate for San Juan County, I care deeply about this community, and I know you do too. Today, making a difference is easy. All you need to do is complete your 2020 census. The census is so important. It determines how funding is allocated for roads, public schools, nonprofits, and many other critical programs. It's only 10 questions. The deadline is nearing. Make sure you get counted and benefit San Juan County. Complete the census when you receive your invitation from the U.S. Census Bureau or visit 2020